So this year is almost over, and although many people I think would say that it was a disappointing year for the future of humanity, at least there was plenty of great Batman stuff going on. This video is going to be a bit rambly. I'm just going to go through all the highlights of Batman's 2016 experience, and forgive me if I miss anything. The year began, as so many do, with the month of January. We were preparing for the end of the New 52 years with some of the last issues of Detective Comics and the final issues of Snyder and Capello's Batman run. At that point, if you recall, Jim Gordon was serving as Batman across the line of comic books, and we're in the middle of the super heavy storyline in the main Batman comic book, which was the result of the fallout of Batman sort of dying, actually losing his memory at the end of the Endgame story. Now, I'm willing to say that Super Heavy was not my favorite arc in the Capello-Snyder Batman run. It felt a bit convoluted in places, like there was too much going on, too many stories being opened up that I don't think were really satisfyingly tied off. And then Snyder and Capello's run ended, so like those story threads seemed to still be dangling. But nonetheless, Super Heavy was still so excellent. It did so many interesting things that you just don't see elsewhere. It subverted a lot of Batman's lore. I think that's the first thing you can say about it. And we're going to talk about this a lot in this video. It sort of began, or at least continued, Scott Snyder's thesis that Batman is more of a symbol than anything, and Batman can actually be anyone. And he's a symbol for hope now as well, which is really interesting. But obviously having Jim Gordon playing Batman sort of suggests that Batman doesn't. Not only can Batman be someone other than Bruce Wayne, but he can be someone other than Bruce Wayne is trained, or someone other than someone fairly ordinary. Jim Gordon is your pretty archetypal ordinary character, and for him to take up the Batman cowl is a pretty big statement that Scott Snyder was making, and certainly not the successor many people would have predicted. But Super Heavy did other things. It had a really interesting Joker storyline going on. That was one of the threads that seemingly was left unresolved, and I'm still curious to see what's going to happen next with that, although it's presumably in the hands of Tom King now. But the Joker he also lost his memory, but also kind of not. And Bruce Wayne and the Joker have lots of interesting park bench discussions in this Twilight Zone sort of situation. Very curious, but very cool. There was also a really interesting Bruce Wayne story, which is not something that you get to say very often, but Super Heavy did a Bruce Wayne story that was really fascinating. And I think I'm willing to say it's definitely the most compelling Bruce Wayne love story that I've ever seen. Bruce Wayne, I think it's hard to write a love interest for him. Batman less so, but Bruce Wayne is such a shell of a man that it's really hard to write a love interest for him. And if you look at Batman, and I guess Bruce Wayne by extension, their love history, you've got Catwoman, Talia al Ghul, Jezebel Jet, and all of them sort of always have ulterior motives. They always have something else going on. But in this love story with Julie Madison, who was actually kind of Batman or Bruce Wayne's first love interest way back when she debuted in like Batman Detective Comics 31 or something, 75, 76 years ago, and she was engaged to Bruce Wayne, and she basically has fallen out of continuity ever since. But Scott Snyder brings her back in a really interesting way, and she doesn't have any of the baggage that the other love interests generally do. She's not actually out for anything else, and she genuinely appeared to be in love with Bruce Wayne, but of course, when he becomes Batman again, she understands that she can't be with him, and that, I think, is so perfect. That's just this is the perfect example of how Snyder, unlike a lot of writers, really just understands Batman so well. And yeah, on that note, the return of Bruce Wayne, which is probably my favorite part of Super Heavy, I could say a bit cynically. I mean, it's great, but the return of Batman is so perfect. He just sort of jumps back onto the scene, and I think he says to Gordon, "Who died and made you Batman?" It's just brilliant. The Return of Batman is so awesome, mainly because of this excellent multiverse issue. They managed to fit into the Return of Batman story. I don't know how they came to the idea that they'd do this, but it's issue 49. Bruce Wayne has decided that the only way to save Gotham is for him to sacrifice his perfect idyllic life and return to the mantle of Batman. And it's basically set to the backdrop of all these other Batman from all across the multiverse, fighting their own battles and getting defeated and getting up and continuing to fight. And it's really just a very innovative way to tell a very simple story. Plus, the art was exceptional. It was one of the few issues not to be drawn by Capullo, but it still looked fantastic. Everything about Bruce Wayne getting his memories back was perfect. The Duke, his new sidekick, showing Bruce the train in issue 47, which turns into a giant pair of bad eyes, looking at the negative space around your memories, I think is incredible. When Batman returns, it's just there's this new energy to him, and he's changed. He's a changed character, and we'll get to that because Snyder really pushed that this year, and I think it carried across a lot of different comic books. The one thing I would say about Super Heavy's conclusion, and again it didn't finish until about March or April, was Gordon in issue 50 spelling out the themes of the run. I think it was a bit too obvious. He sort of says that, Batman is a symbol for hope, and if we believe in him, he'll believe in us, and anyone can do great things, etc., etc. Bit obvious. It had to be said. Just it would have been weird not to have said it after 14 or whatever, however many issues Super Heavy was, really pushing this idea that anyone can be Batman, to not sum it up that way. But I felt like it was a bit obvious, but it was fine, and it was a really good, strong last arc for Snyder and Capullo. They weren't done, but we'll come back to that a bit later on. And the next thing that happened in the year, in February, we got the terminally delayed Dark Knight Returns: The Master Race number 3, which was originally meant to come in January, I think. This was sort of when the issues in this series started to emerge. Even with Frank Miller apparently not doing much on this series, it's still falling apart. And I'm sure some people like it. I'm sorry, I don't. I'll probably come back and look at it in totality later on, but for now, I just don't know what's going on with it. It keeps getting delayed. The delays are plaguing this series. And worse, a lot of the issues, they just feel like the plot is just devoid of any substance. There's one issue where really nothing happens. It's just about Batman just assembling his allies and just taking the fight to the Kryptonians. And, it just ends on such a dud note. Like, it feels like nothing happened in the issue. And I don't know what the point of it was, and you just left feeling a little bit cheated. The other thing is that Frank Miller's backup stories, which you can tell he hasn't had any help with because they're terrible. They're completely pointless. The Green Lantern one at the beginning was okay, and the Batgirl one was weird, but whatever. The Supergirl one about Superman's daughter, whatever her name is, Kara? No, is it Kara? I don't remember. Is just meaningless. It's just so meaningless. Basically, what happens is that one of the Kandorians is, trying to woo Superman's daughter, whatever her name is, and they fly around a bit, and then it ends. And that's seriously the whole backup story, and I just don't understand what is going on. More recently, in like issue 6, whatever we're up to, Batman actually appeared to die. He actually got hit by the laser vision of one of the Kryptonians, the Kandorians, and his heart appeared to stop, which is interesting because he's obviously not dead, because Frank Miller's already talking about The Dark Knight Returns 4 and The Dark Knight Returns 5. Can't wait for those. But yeah, this series started out pretty strong and it was exciting, but I don't hold much hope for it, unfortunately, and I'll come back to it when it's finished. But yeah, by March, Super Heavy actually ended. This was when issue 50 came out, and we also got, I think, what I would say is, and there were some good issues of Detective Comics, though mostly during the New 52 run, Detective Comics was pretty disappointing. It just felt really unnecessary and floundering and couldn't really find its groove. Later on it got a lot better, and I read a few of the later arcs. But I think issue 50 of Detective Comics New 52 by Peter Tomasi was the best issue, and I think it was in this issue where I actually saw Jim Gordon as Batman for the first time. The issue itself is nothing, it's nothing world-shattering. The story and the plot of the issue is actually very simple and self-contained. It's like a 2-issue arc, I think, 49 and 50, about this killer who's kidnapping people, and basically he's creating masks by putting resin on statues around Gotham, and Batman figures it out, and he's able to, take the resin he finds on the mask apart and locate the guy, and he solves the riddle, and then it ends with a big sword fight. It's all very exciting, and at the end, Harvey Bullock shows up and says, you are the Dark Knight after all, and Jim Gordon smiles, and it's perfect, and I can totally buy that. I can totally buy that Jim Gordon is Batman in that story, pretty much more than I could in the main Batman series, because it didn't have all the baggage attached to it in Snyder's run, where he was focusing on trying to prove himself the entire time, and then before you knew it was over. But I guess not having to worry about that baggage really worked in Detective Comics, and it was really cool to see that issue. Plus, that issue finishes with a really cool backup, which actually reminded me a bit of Batman Black and White, although it's not so much a story as it is a tribute to the different artists who've drawn Batman over the years. There is some seriously slick art in here from a ton of great names, really iconic stuff, and I absolutely recommend this issue. Now, I think something else happened in March, but I can't quite remember. My therapist says I have repressed memories from that period, but I can't quite. No, it was nothing. April gets my vote for Best Batman of the Year. Just Best Batman of the Year. 2 things happened in April that were awesome. Firstly, we had issue 51 of the New 52 run of Batman, which is the best single-issue Batman story of the year, and one of my favorites of all time, though you have to kind of view it with respect to the other 50 issues that came beforehand. Issue 51 tells the story of a quiet night in Gotham City, which is not something that happens very often. And it's also, sort of, you imagine, difficult to plot out an issue in which nothing actually happens, like deliberately nothing happens. But that's exactly what happens in this issue, basically nothing. And yet it's still, I think, one of my favorite Batman stories ever. It works so well because it ties right back into issue 1 of the New 52 run, which is actually one of the first comic books I ever read. I'm ashamed to admit I was very late comer to comic books, but it ties back into issue 1 of the New 52, in which the question basically is, what is Gotham? Or Gotham is how it's phrased. And it's a question from the Gotham Gazette, in which people write in, suggesting answers to the Gotham is question. Basically, this is a really common thing Scott Snyder does across a lot of his stories. He did it in Black Mirror as well, which was the story he wrote about Nightwing taking up the Batman mantle in Detective Comics before he wrote the mainline Batman story, and it was really effective there as well, and it's really effective here. And basically, the conclusion that he comes to in issue 51 is that Gotham is you, right? Which is what Batman says to Gothamites and what Gothamites say about Batman. And it ties into this notion that anyone can be Batman, anyone can be a hero, and Batman can be a symbol of hope and optimism. Which is an incredible subversion, because in the first issue, to say that Gotham is Batman, and it seems like a doomsayer's answer. But by issue 51, it seems like Gotham is Batman, Gotham is you, is actually a really optimistic answer. I think that is the ultimate accomplishment of Snyder's run, is that he's managed to really transform our modern notion of Batman as a comic book character. And that's he wasn't done though, but this is a turning point. Certainly was issue 51. Weirdly, issue 52, which came afterwards, go figure, was not actually connected to the previous 51 issues. It told its own standalone story and wasn't written by Snyder. I don't know if Snyder just didn't want to write an extra issue, or if he couldn't drag it out to 52 issues. But man, of all the times to fall short, like what? I don't know what they were thinking. And 52 is not a particularly good story either. It's like very basic and completely detached, and it just feels really arbitrary, and I don't like it. I don't know why it's there. But anyway, 51 is awesome. If you haven't read it, go read it. The other thing that I mentioned that happened in April was Paul Dini's autobiographical story, The Dark Knight, A True Batman Story is the title. And what a graphic novel it is. It's basically the story of Paul Dini, who was a writer on the animated series in the 90s, and he wrote some of the Batman games, like he wrote Arkham City and Arkham Asylum for Rocksteady, and he's worked on a ton of other Batman stuff. And he created Harley Quinn. He's like one of the great Batman writers. And while he was working on the animated series, he was actually beaten up by a couple of goons one night, and he struggled with, and the graphic novel is about his struggle with writing fiction, writing fictional tales of a very optimistic hero, or someone who always saves the day, at least, when he was living in a world where that hero didn't exist, where heroes don't exist, where people actually get beaten up quite remorselessly, where terrible things do happen to people. And that symbol, that optimism, that fiction doesn't come to save you. And it's a really fascinating exploration of this idea that fiction is ultimately just make-believe, and what value does fiction have? It's asking some very high concept questions, some really big things, and it does it so well. He's so Paul Dini. He's so exposed in this. He goes into explicit details of his personal life. He talks about self-loathing and self-hatred, and the story also features Paul Dini giving a pitch. I don't know if this is real or not, but he gives a pitch for an episode of the animated series in which Batman is almost killed, and he's sort of dangling in between. He's on the boundary line, and he's met by Morpheus, the Sandman, and he sort of questions Batman as to whether or not he's inspiring people or he's actually scaring them. And it's sort of an exploration of Batman's role in the psyche of everyday people, which I think is really interesting that it was published this year, considering Scott Snyder's own thesis about Batman. So those two actually go together really well, and they were released in the same month, so maybe they coordinated. But fantastic graphic novel. I really wish that episode of the animated series had been made. And again, as I say, April was the best month for Batman this year. Now let's skip ahead to June, which actually saw the beginning of DC Rebirth and the end of the New 52. Thank God. At the time, I think Rebirth was met cautiously. I certainly was a bit cautious about it. But I think now it's safe to say Rebirth is maybe the best thing that's ever happened. Rebirth has been really interesting for Batman, if no one else. Firstly, Tom King took over the main Batman series, and Scott Snyder's still working on a Batman story in All-Star Batman. We'll talk about that later. But the main Batman story, Batman Rebirth by Tom King, is it's a fortnightly affair now rather than a monthly affair, which means that like all the fortnightly comic books, the art is not as consistent, and they have several artists working on any one issue. But overall, the quality is pretty good. I will say that. It's not as good as Snyder's work. It's not as good as Capullo's work, but the issues themselves, the new mainline Batman comic book is not as good as the New 52 Batman. It's probably the only comic book that's true of, but it's certainly true of this one. The first issue of this, not the Rebirth issue about Calendar Man, which is itself great, but the actual first issue in which we meet Gotham and Gotham Girl, is incredible. It's a really, really good issue, and Batman basically is like seconds away from dying in it, and he's like about to do it, which would have been really anticlimactic for the first issue, but he's saved at the last minute by Gotham and Gotham Girl. But it really gets you going, gets you excited. Like, Tom King knows how to start a series, and he really appreciates Batman as well. That's really clear. There's a lot of interesting gadgets, and there's a lot of really cool stuff going on, and there's like a Matches Malone reference in one of the later issues, like issue 6 or something. I'll put it on the screen. But yeah, I was really excited to see Matches Malone appear in an issue. Detective Comics is also really good. Some people may even argue better than the mainstream Batman, the mainline Batman comic. Though it's not really a Batman story. It's actually sort of a group book in which Batwoman is training a bunch of the sidekicks, which at the beginning anyway was like Tim Drake, Spoiler, Clayface, someone else. Bluebird? Is Bluebird in it? I don't know. But yeah, Clayface is in it. Interesting choice indeed. The first arc of Detective Comics was really good. It is about the group, I don't know do they have a name? I don't think they have a name, going up against Kate Kane, Batwoman's father, who's a military guy, and he's created like a group called the Batman or something. Yeah, and good stuff, really strong issue, really strong arc. Tim Drake dies at the end, is one thing that happens, and although he's not really dead, he's actually just in a prison somewhere, which is interesting. I think it's one of the first big hints about the whole Watchmen in the DC Universe thing, though that's still not really very clear. The Victim Syndicate arc that's happening at the moment is still interesting, but it's early days. The other thing that's happened because of this Rebirth thing is now that Snyder isn't working on the main Batman comic book anymore, they're doing crossovers again. So Batman, Detective Comics, and Nightwing had a big crossover with the Night of the Monster Men, which is about Hugo Strange turning some of his patients into giant monsters that run around Gotham infecting people and attacking buildings, and it's very Japanese actually, a lot of kaiju influence. And that's something that didn't really happen in the New 52 at all, so that was really cool to see. The arc, the event itself wasn't great, it wasn't something the first 3 or 4 issues you could probably skip of 6, but it had a cool ending, and Hugo Strange was obviously the mastermind. It's a throwback to the original Night of the Monster Men, or just Monster Men, whatever it was called. And the way Batman catches him is pretty cool. And then in August we got the first episode of Telltale's Batman game, which the game press loved for some reason. Unfortunately, they're all idiots, as they really don't know anything about Batman whatsoever. I'm tired of reading articles claiming this is the second coming of Batman, the second coming of Bob Kane and Bill Finger, or Grant Morrison, or whoever the best bet, Frank Miller, maybe the second coming of Frank Miller. Anyway, it isn't. It really isn't. It's really not. I can't stress that enough. It's not a good Batman story by any means, and we'll go through why. But before we get to the story, the game, it's a typical Telltale game. If you've played any of their games, you know that they're broken, really broken. In this one, though, I'd say also the performances aren't very good. The most notable voice actor I'm aware of in the game is Troy Baker, who actually, fun fact, voiced the Joker in Arkham Origins, and he's the first actor to voice both the Joker and Batman. He also voiced Arkham Knight in Arkham Knight, which was Jason Todd. So he's voiced Jason Todd, the Joker, and Batman, and he completely fucks it up. His Bruce Wayne is such a whiny little bitch. It's really, really grating to listen to, and I don't understand why. You know, they're going for like a sort of a year one Batman and sort of a more grounded approach, like the Nolan films. But, you know, Bruce Wayne wasn't a bitch in those films. I don't know why he has to be here. It's really... it's tiring to listen to it, and it's just nothing like I imagine Bruce Wayne to be. So, that sucks. Also, the gameplay is bad. There's a lot of these, like, Yahtzee Croshaw calls them slow time events. Like, just little interactions where, like, they're not quick time events. You don't have to, like... The game will wait for you to do it. Like, you got to tap a button on Batman's phone or something for the game to continue. It's not a choice. It's not like an interaction. It's just like you only have one option. Just push this button or just sit there and watch the scene continue forever. And it's just pointless. And it serves no purpose. And all it does is highlight its own redundancy. I think it's a metaphor for these Telltale games, actually. In general, the scale of the game feels really, really small. You have very limited interaction with the world itself, and you only really get to move around in these skyboxes where, like, all the movement is predetermined, and basically you may be able to see a nice horizon, but you certainly can't get there or move around in it. And it's really quite disappointing, I think. Also, it's probably because the Telltale engine that they use in all their games just can't handle anything. There was this big debate between, like, Harvey Dent and, like, the incumbent mayor in the second episode, and the crowd for this big debate, I swear, was about 10 NPCs in this huge hall, and it just looked pathetic. It just looked so stupid. They were trying to build all this tension, and there are only, like, you know, a dozen witnesses. It's really, really, it breaks the immersion for me. I know these games aren't really about immersion, but, you know, they could do a little bit better than that, I think. The gameplay, you know, the actual fighting and stuff is really, really limited. And from a story perspective, you know, Batman has all these gadgets that allow him to, like, plan out his route and stuff. But why does Batman need gadgets to take out 3 guys? Like, come on, he's Batman, for fuck's sake. He doesn't need a drone to tell him how to punch someone. But that's there. Also, the detective puzzles are really, really simple, and they involve just looking at everything in the environment and then just linking things together until you solve it. But it's always really obvious what the solutions are, and you know, if it's not obvious, all you've got to do is just keep clicking until you link them together. So I kind of wish they weren't there. And, you know, all these problems, like the technical problems with the engine and the glitches and the fact that the game doesn't run properly, the lip syncing, the motion capture, the terrible animation, it would all be forgivable if the story was actually good. But as I've said, the story is not good, it's not unique, it's not interesting, and it's really average. It's really tremendously average is, like, the best thing I can say about it. It's clearly interested in being like Christopher Nolan or Earth 1. Jeff Johns, Earth 1? Did Jeff Johns write Earth 1? Not sure. But they want to write, like, they want to tell, like, a grounded Batman story where there aren't any, you know, superhumans or anything, and Batman's enemies are, like, politicians and, like, street thugs, and, like, all the characters have been reimagined as, like, ordinary people, and they've basically taken, like, all the cool stuff out. And they did that really well. They took out everything that was cool and interesting about Batman, and what was left was terrible. Basically, there's a version of Cobblepot Penguin in this story. Doesn't really make any sense. He's basically the same character as ever, only he's handsome rather than disfigured. It doesn't make any sense because Bruce Wayne and Batman, like, they know that he is the bad guy, basically from the start, and, like, yeah, they can't catch him for some reason. They don't even try, and he also manages to like legitimately take over Wayne Enterprises. Like, he's just chosen to take over Wayne Enterprises despite having like a criminal record and like being disgraced, and it doesn't make any sense from a story perspective. But that happens, and also the big sort of subversion that they're doing is that Vicky Vale, the unassuming reporter, is actually the bad guy. Alright, that's interesting. It's kind of like just picking the least suspicious character you can think of, with a history of just being a nothing character, simply to surprise the player. It doesn't really make any sense, and I'm sure there's gonna be like a backstory that they reveal in episode 5 as to why she was the bad guy all along, but it just feels very cheap and just like this random swerve just to sort of catch everyone off guard. And yeah, it certainly caught me off guard because it's stupid. It's completely stupid. Vicky Vale she's a nothing character. But anyway, that happened. And Harvey Dent's in this game. He's perhaps the most traditional, so much so that he's actually completely predictable, and you can see the ending before it even begins. The other thing about this game, though, and particularly with the Harvey Dent thing, is that your choices in this game just don't matter whatsoever. Which is really quite crap, because it tells you at the start of the game that the game responds to your choices or whatever, except it really, really doesn't. The choices do nothing at all. For example, in the first episode, I chose there was this interrogation scene with this thug, and you can choose to go to town on him with this pipe, or you can just just intimidate him. And I just chose to intimidate him, which is the least violent option possible. And I basically left him alive, completely conscious, I think. I don't think he was he's just sort of handcuffed to upside down. He was fine. He was completely fine. I've done much worse to plenty of other people, even in this game. And then when I got back to the Batcave, Alfred got really angry about it and said I'd brutalized him, and that's completely not what happened. So I don't know what happened there. But the other really big decision that this game screwed me on was with Harvey Dent. I chose, because I could see it happening, I chose to save Harvey Dent from being disfigured by Penguin and getting half his face burned off. And it's interesting because you can actually stop Harvey Dent from becoming disfigured in this game, and I chose to do that. And he was fine. He went to hospital, but that's the best possible outcome. And he was back on his feet in a day, and he was not injured at all, as far as I can tell. But he became Two-Face anyway. The next time I saw him, the next conversation I had with him, he was already manifesting split personalities, and that is just so cheap, so completely cheap. If the game's point was that choice doesn't matter, and we live in a deterministic reality where everyone's predestined to end up doing the same things, then fair enough. But that's clearly not the game's point. It actually goes out of its way to say that your choices matter when they don't, and I don't appreciate being lied to. Telltale. And look, this is just part of the wider problem with this game, that it tries to subvert expectations of Batman lore, but the subversions just don't make any sense. Like, the Vicky Vale thing doesn't make sense, and the other thing this story tried to push at the beginning, anyway, it seems to have forgotten recently, was that the Thomas and Martha Wayne were gangsters. They were involved in the criminal underworld of Gotham before Bruce was aware of things. And it's a twist that's been done before. I think, for instance, in the Black Glove saga, Thomas Wayne or someone claiming to be Thomas Wayne comes back. And, it's not really a corruption thing, but he comes back as a bad guy, etc., etc. Never confirmed if it is him or not, sort of thing. Even if you compare this to Scott Snyder's Court of Owls thing, where Owlman appears and claims to be Batman's brother, who was, sick as a child and everyone thought he was dead, or maybe he wasn't born at all, not clear. It's ambiguous in these stories, and there's enough room in there for multiple interpretations, there's enough room in there for new characters to emerge, but it never fundamentally changes the story, and that's sort of important to superhero comic books and Batman. But here, they really have fundamentally change the story, and they haven't really done a very good job of addressing it. They just sort of, it happened, and then it hasn't been mentioned for several episodes. And it doesn't make any sense that Alfred would have been okay with it, or that Bruce wouldn't have known about it. And if it is in fact the case, and they're not going to swerve again because the last issue's not out, the last chapter's not out yet, then it doesn't make any sense. So basically, I have gripes with this one. It's the story it's telling doesn't feel very Batman, I have to say, and yeah, I have trouble recommending it. Clearly, Telltale just wants to make an animated film, but for some reason they make it as a game. It's very annoying. Telltale cannot write dialogue for shit. And I'm really getting tired of their formula. More than anything, I'm getting tired of people saying that their games are great, because they're not. There are plenty of better Batman games out there now. That's enough about that. I don't want to end on a negative note, so I'm going to finish by talking about All-Star Batman, which was a book that I was really excited to read when it was announced. And it's basically the project Scott Snyder has moved on to since his New 52 run on Batman ended. It's being drawn by John Romita Jr., which, you know what John Romita Jr. art looks like. It looks like that. And it's a very different book to what I expected, I have to say. I don't dislike it. I think it's really, really interesting. But it's really different to anything Scott Snyder has done beforehand. And it's really quite different to any other Batman story I can think of. Well, for starters, it's worth saying that I'm glad Snyder's still doing his own thing, away from the other Batman books, in his own sort of enclosed-off little world, desperate for creative control as he is, and for good reason if anyone who has read the Clone Saga is listening. But it's basically a road trip sort of story in which Batman is trying to take Two-Face to some convenient backstory house which was never mentioned until this series, in which Batman and Two-Face were friends or spent some time together, and somehow getting him there will cure him. Not really clear at this point. There's a lot going on here that hasn't been answered. There's a story, basically Two-Face at the same time has blackmailed everyone else in the world into trying to stop Batman, because he's been reimagined as like an information broker, which I think is pretty clever as far as modern adaptations go. And he's told everyone that unless they stop Batman, he's going to release all the dirt on them. So basically it's Batman versus the world, which is, yeah, pretty cool. Basically, at the moment it looks like Gordon is going after, and the GCP are going after Bruce and Batman. And it looks like Alfred is also going after Batman. He shot down the Batplane, apparently. So there's a lot still to come, clearly, in this story. Stylistically, it actually feels a bit, I don't know, Tarantino-esque to me. It's very pulpy, and they have like a mile counter to track like how far he's traveled, and it's often used a bit satirically, and it's kind of funny when the mile counter comes up. It's very tonally like light-hearted, even though it's quite graphically violent. And Batman like makes a lot of jokes in this story, which is probably the biggest shift as far as Snyder's writing goes. The other thing about it is that for a book called All-Star Batman, it's not so far been much of a tribute to the full range of Batman. I mean, what I was so excited for when I heard the title All-Star Batman was like an All-Star Superman style Batman story. I thought that's what we were getting, and we haven't got that here. I thought, especially with Scott Snyder writing it, can you imagine? But this is still really interesting. It's very much about this new specific version of Batman that Snyder is pushing at the moment, as like a fun, sort of upbeat, joke-cracking, optimistic Batman. And strangely, it works. It works having Batman smiling every now and then and making jokes and cursing. And, there's one scene in the latest issue, issue 4 at the moment, where Batman he's captured along with Two-Face and Duke, and they're like pinned up on these wheels, and Batman's like got knives stuck through his wrists, and he like makes a joke about taking a shit, and it's just fantastic. It's this is a version of Batman that's very much unlike anything else I can imagine. It's not like the really dark, brooding version that popular culture has reduced him to in recent years, and it's not like the dignified Kevin Conroy version or the ultra campy Adam West Batman. This is like a new beast entirely, and that looks like where Scott Snyder's taking him. So I'm excited to see where that goes. But as I look back on 2016 and I remember all the great Batman stories that I read, I'm left with the belief that the best stories are still yet to be written. When you have a character that is this old, that people are still reinventing and reinvigorating after 77 odd years, the only thing you can be sure of is that surely the best is yet to come. That in mind, I think we'll remember 2016 as a turning point for the character, as he became more complex and multifaceted than just the dark, brooding force of vengeance that pop culture likes to reduce him to being. He has also had as much, if not more, popular attention this year than I think ever before. And, it's a shame that the bigger projects this year were marred with some of the worst creative decisions and controversies, while the best stories went largely unappreciated. We can only hope that moving forward, the new legions of Batman fans that grow every year can find their way to the incredible trove of Bat stories that lie just beneath the fringe of the mainstream. And when they do, we'll be waiting for them. So, thanks for listening.
It was nice of Commissioner Gordon to give you that recording of It's a Wonderful Life.
And it is a wonderful life.
It has its moments.